Good afternoon. There's still some more seats down there. Yep. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Alasdair MacIntyre to this afternoon's session of the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture's 18th annual Fall Conference. We remember these well. Many members of the audience today, I'm sure, were in this auditorium on the occasion of many of these presentations. Professor MacIntyre has certainly spoken more frequently at these conferences, and I would say more memorably, than at any other speaker in its history. Professor MacIntyre is a senior research fellow at the Center for Contemporary Aristotelian Studies in Ethics and Politics, KCEP, at London Metropolitan University, and a senior distinguished research fellow at Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture. He's the author of 30 books, including the influential quintet of books, After Virtue, Whose Justice, Which Rationality, Three Rival Versions of Moral Inquiry, and Dependent Rational Animals. His most recent book, published by Cambridge University Press in the last year, 2016, was entitled The Conflicts of Modernity, an essay on desire, practical reasoning, and narrative. This book continues to pursue an understanding of the modern condition from a neo-Aristotelian or Thomistic perspective, and argues that Thomistic Aristotelianism, informed by Marx's insights, provides us with resources for constructing a contemporary politics and ethics which both enable and require us to act, in MacIntyre's own words, against modernity from within modernity. Although this book may seem to bring his overall project to a final completion with this 5th volume in the series, one suspects more is coming. Professor MacIntyre is a member of the American Philosophical Society, along with Benjamin Franklin, and has served as president of the Eastern Division of the American Philosophical Association. Franklin was not elected to office in the APA. MacIntyre has taught at Oxford, Princeton, Brandeis, Boston University, Wellesley, Vanderbilt, Duke, and happily for us, the University of Notre Dame, where he was the Reverend John A. O'Brien, Senior Research Professor in our Department of Philosophy. Although he retired from teaching in 2010, Professor MacIntyre remains domiciled at the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture, where he continues to write and to conduct his research. He stays busy. The title of his presentation this afternoon is From Grammar to Metaphysics, From Adjectives to Evil. To evils. All right. Please join me in welcoming Professor MacIntyre to the podium.
Let me express my gratitude to Professor Solomon, not only for his generous words now, but for the way in which his work has helped to sustain mine over the years, and in which his expositions, criticisms of various things I've written, and also his placing of my work in relation to the history of modern moral philosophy has been salutary in enabling me to rethink what I'm doing. If one was to define the best kind of colleague that one could have, then David Solomon would be the exemplar. This paper has 4 parts. I begin by looking at how the words good and bad are used in everyday language. And I argue that some of those commonplace uses presuppose a conception of what it is for human beings to flourish qua human beings. Secondly, I further argue that such a conception finds expression in those uses of good in which we make our actions intelligible to others, and indeed to ourselves, by identifying various goods as providing us with reasons for acting as we do. And I ask what qualities we need if we are to act as good human beings do. This enables me to formulate the problem posed in the third part of this paper. If to act intelligibly is to act for the sake of achieving what is taken to be good, how is it that we act badly in so many ways? We need an answer to this question if we are to inquire, the topic of the fourth and final part, why and under what circumstances we might be justified in speaking not of good and bad, but of good and evil. Unlike, for example, the adjectives red and rectangular, the adjectives good and bad are noun-dependent adjectives. That is, the criteria for their correct application as adjectives vary with the noun to which they're attached. The standards by which we judge jam to be good jam are very different from those by which we judge a president to be a good president, or a chess player a good chess player. And as with good and bad, so too with their comparatives and with the expression good at. What it is to be good at solving differential equations is very different from what it is to be good at mountain climbing. Notice that our uses of bad, worse, and worst are secondary to and dependent on our uses of good, better, and best. We only know what it is for something or someone to be a bad such and such, or bad at so and so, if we know what it would be for that same something or someone to be a good such and such, or good at so and so. What then do these various adjectival uses of good and bad have in common? An answer to this question was provided by Peter Geach. I quote, "Normally, and other things being equal, a man who wants an A will choose a good A and will not choose a bad A, or rather will choose an A that he thinks good and will not choose an A that he thinks bad. How much agreement there is on what individuals think to be good varies from case to case. About jam and chess playing, there's near universal agreement. About presidents and education, a good deal less than that. Notice too that we speak of some liars as good liars and of some forgers as better than others at forging signatures. These adjectival uses of good have nothing to do with moral approval, except in one clearly discrepant case: good human being, or good woman, or good man. But we immediately notice that this can't be the same kind of adjectival use of good, since it makes no sense to apply Geach's characterization to it. We know what it is to want jam, or a chess player, or an education, but what would it be to want a human being? We can imagine bizarre cases, of course. A museum of animal species has been founded to exhibit one member of each species, and they advertise that they are in need of one elephant, one wolf, and one human being, all in good condition. But such cases throw no light on our ordinary use of good human being. So what do we mean by it? If we are to understand how good is used in good human being, we must first take note of a very different grammatical construction, that of sentences in which good and bad are used either to assert that it is good or bad that such and such is the case, or to question, is it good or bad that such and such is the case? We may assert without redundancy that it's good that the jam that is being served is good jam, and we may ask without paradox whether it may not be bad to be a good liar. So what do we mean when we assert that it is good that, or that it is bad that? Someone who says this always invites the question, good for whom or bad for whom? And until this question is answered, her or his assertion is incomplete. So in particular cases, we might spell out what we mean by asserting that it's good for those of us who are eating it that good jam is being served, or by asking whether it may not only be bad for those who are lied to, but also bad for the liar, that someone is a good liar. What then does it mean to say that something is good for someone? It is, I suggest, to say that something contributes to, or is partially constitutive of, that someone's flourishing qua human being. What then is it for human beings to flourish qua human beings? Human beings, we need to remind ourselves, are members of one particular animal species, and the question that we're asking about human beings can be asked and answered unproblematically about the members of any animal species. We know, for example, what it is for individual elephants and for herds of elephants to flourish. We know what it is for individual wolves and packs of wolves to flourish. And as with elephants and wolves, so too with human beings. To flourish is to develop so that one is able in one's actions and through one's social relationships to educate those habits and powers that mark one out as a member of one's species. What distinguishes human beings from members of other animal species is that they are rational animals, animals with the specific potentialities of rational action and rational inquiry, able to learn to act only insofar as they have good reason to act. What they must learn, if they are so to act, is how to identify and rank order goods. For to say that someone has a good reason for acting in this way rather than that is just to say that by acting in this way, she or he will achieve or bring about some good that would not be achieved by acting in that way. Of course, it may also be the case that by acting in that way rather than this, she or he will achieve or bring about some good that would not be achieved or brought about by acting in this way. Such an agent in such a situation therefore needs to know how to rank order goods and how to choose between them in particular situations. That is, needs to be able to recognize what different kinds of good contribute to her or his flourishing, as she or he is in that particular time and place. For what it is to flourish is very different for different individuals and different groups in different times and places. What a 20-year-old farmer in 18th century Ireland needed to flourish was very different from what was needed by a 19th century 40-year-old Japanese peasant woman or by a 20th century 60-year-old American welder. How then do we learn how to rank order goods and to make good choices? We begin at an early age by learning from our parents and other elders to distinguish between, on the one hand, what is good for us, what we need, and on the other, what we want, and also between what we need most at this particular stage and what we need most at that. But in learning how gradually to become independent of those teachers and elders by making judgments that are genuinely our own, we also learn, or should learn, how important our continuing dependence on others is if we are to become and continue as adequately rational agents. For as rational agents, we have to deliberate, and we only deliberate well, as both Aristotle and Aquinas insist, when we deliberate in the company of others. Why so? First of all, because we're each of us always apt, even at our best, to take a one-sided and partial view of things, and we therefore need correction by well-informed and critical others. Secondly, because even when the goods about which we are deliberating are goods that we enjoy and find rewarding as individuals, we can only achieve those goods by cooperating with others who are pursuing their individual goods. And it's only through shared deliberation that we can secure their cooperation. And thirdly, because among the most important goods that we need to achieve if we are to flourish are common goods, goods constituted by our relationships to those others who happen to share these particular common goods, such goods as those of family life and of a variety of communal activities. How then do we become good at deliberating with others as rational agents? Our relationships with those others must be such that each of us advances what she or he takes to be genuinely good reasons for acting in this way rather than that, just because they are good reasons, and not because the speaker is trying to please or is afraid of offending. It follows that each of us must be able to trust the others to be scrupulously truthful. To be truthful, we need three things. We need a rule against lying that prohibits almost all lies. We need to be disposed to be discreet, not to gossip, to think before speaking. And we need to care that not only our utterances, but also our beliefs are true, and that we are well informed on matters relevant to our practical lives. Lacking any of these, we will be defective in the virtue of truthfulness, which is one part and aspect of the virtue of justice. And indeed, others with whom we deliberate need to be able to trust us not only to be truthful, but to act justly more generally in our dealings with them. One mark of just human beings is that they recognize that they are bound to refrain from acting unjustly, no matter what the consequences. And it's only in and through relationships informed by justice that we're each of us able to identify and achieve those goods that it's good and best for each of us and all of us to achieve. Yet here, of course, we're in disputed territory, for it's held by some very influential thinkers in our society that we should each of us do as much good as possible, and that if, by performing an unjust act, we can bring it about that significantly more good is done than would otherwise be the case, then we are not only permitted to, but we ought to act unjustly. From this point of view, someone who abstains from unjust acts, no matter what the consequences, fails as a moral agent, is bad in a notable way. What reason then might there be to reject this opposing standpoint, one which ascribes overriding value to the exercise of benevolence? The answer is that it makes each of us a potential victim of the exercise of benevolence by others. No matter what the bonds between us, there may always arise circumstances in which the greater good will require of you that you should treat me unjustly, which is to say that there are, on this view, no legitimate human relationships that can be defined as involving unconditional commitments. In fact, however, some of the most valuable relationships that we have require unconditional commitments, of spouse to spouse, of parent to child, of friend to friend, of citizen to nation. If we're to identify and achieve the goods that such relationships make possible, then we must recognize that justice and not benevolence is overriding, while also acknowledging the just demands of benevolence. But this has to be more than an abstract and intellectual exercise. It must involve a settled disposition to inquire what justice requires in this or that particular situation, and to act as justice requires. And it's impossible for any agent to be adequately just unless that agent also possesses other major virtues in at least some measure. For being just on occasion requires one to be courageous or temperate, and it always requires the exercise of good judgment. To be virtuous, then, is one and the same as being disposed to act only for sufficiently good reasons. And to fail in one or more of the virtues, to fail in this respect to be a good human being, is to be insufficiently disposed so to act. So a catalogue of the virtues is a catalogue of just those qualities that human beings need if they are to act well, if they are to function well as rational agents, if they are to be intelligible as rational agents. Yet if this were the whole story of how we make our actions intelligible, it would be notable how often those actions would seem to be unintelligible. All too often, agents who are plainly well situated to achieve some particular good, which they badly need, instead pursue something else, some object of as yet unsatisfied desire. We as external observers may be puzzled as to why they act as they do. They as agents may represent the object of their desire to themselves as the good that at this moment deserves their attention and action. But sometimes, even to themselves, they admit, when thinking about what they did, that I just wanted that too much. That's to say, if we're to make our actions adequately intelligible, we need to give an account of the parts played by both goods and desires in making those actions what they are. And once again, it will be important to characterize agents in terms of the virtues, since to act from desire rather than for the sake of some good just is to be deficient in one or more of the virtues. But to understand how and why this is so, we must attend to a further aspect of desire. What do we want from our earliest days? Not to be in pain, and especially not to be in extreme pain. What do we continue to want very much? Not to be in extreme pain. We are, like many other animal species, liable to pain because of our animal nature. Pain disables, and insofar as it disables, what is bad about it is that it deprives us of our ability to achieve goods. But to suffer pain, especially extreme pain, whether it disables or not, is in itself bad. Pain thus constitutes an exception to the claim that everything bad is bad only as a deprivation of some good, an absence of some good. Pain is an absence of well-being and therefore bad, but also bad in itself. Why is it important to emphasize this? Because we have to understand ourselves as having the specific vulnerabilities of rational animals, vulnerabilities that make each of us recurrently dependent on the goodwill and generosity of others, including the goodwill and generosity of strangers. We're then intelligible to ourselves as well as to others only as agents engaged in a complex shared enterprise, one in which not only do we need others if we're to achieve the common goods that they and we share, but we need others if we're to find remedies for the pains that afflict us. Where has the argument taken us so far? We began by looking at various adjectival uses of good and bad, and among these found ourselves uniquely puzzled by their uses when the noun or noun phrase to which they're attached is woman, man, or human being. We then asked what it is to say that something is good for someone, and my proposal was that to say this is to say that that something contributes to, or is partially constitutive of, the flourishing of that someone, a human being. Good human beings, we then noted, can be characterized in a number of ways, as those who act so as to achieve their own flourishing, as those who exercise the virtues, and as those who act for certain kinds of reason. But we need now to add one further characterization of ourselves as agents. Insofar as we are functioning well as human beings, we not only pursue goods, but we do so in a way that presupposes that we have a final end. An agent who acts so as to achieve some particular good in some particular set of circumstances always invites the question, why then and there did you pursue that good? To which the answer must be either that she or he pursued it for its own sake, or that she or he pursued it as a means to some further good. If the latter, the next question must be what it was that made that further good worth pursuing, and so on, but not interminably. Every successful justificatory and explanatory account must terminate with the identification of some good that it was worth pursuing for its own sake. What then is it for some agent to say of some good that it's worth pursuing for its own sake? It's to say that it contributes to and is partially constitutive of the flourishing of that agent's life, and yet there is always more and other to the flourishing of any agent's life than the achievement of any set of finite particular goods, no matter how impressive or worthwhile. For whenever such a good or set of goods is achieved, the question always arises, so what do I do next? No finite and particular good or set of goods perfects and completes a life. Yet the finite and particular goods that contribute to the flourishing of particular agents are accounted as goods for those agents only insofar as their achievement points beyond them towards the perfecting and completion of that agent's life. We are then directed in our actions towards an ultimate good, a good about which we can say little except in general and negative terms. It is that for the sake of which whatever is worth doing is worth doing. It's to be loved as no finite good is to be loved, and if we substitute any finite good for it as the object of our devotion, we will have an illusory conception of that finite good. It is, whatever it is, not finite. But even our partial and inadequate grasp of that good matters, because it is inseparable from our awareness that we are by our nature directed not only towards but beyond the particular goods that we aspire to achieve, and that if we fail to be so directed in our practice, we fail as human agents. We inhabit an order, that is, defined not only by space and time, by the minerals, plants, and animals of our environment, by the social relationships of our culture, by the psychology of our desires, but also by the goods for the sake of which we act. If we were to catalogue the bad things that human agents can suffer and do, we would have to take all of these into account. Being in the wrong place at the wrong time, starting a forest fire or a landslide, being attacked by a shark or a wasp, suffering from the common cold or from tuberculosis, not knowing from whom we need to learn, wanting too much or too little or too soon, caring about others so intensely that we forget to care about ourselves, caring about ourselves so intensely that we forget what we owe to others, engaging in or suffering from the effects of various destructive and self-destructive enterprises. This list could become very, very long, and in any version it raises the question, how then should we think systematically about bads? All badness suffered or perpetrated by human agents is failure, is defectiveness in functioning well as a human being. Some bad suffered, as I already noted in the case of extreme pain, are also bad in themselves, but they too are defects in human functioning. Such failure has at least 3 different kinds of cause, and if I catalogue them, it's only to remind us of what we already know well. Often human beings don't function well because non-human agencies disrupt or destroy their normal functioning, as with earthquakes, animal predators, or infectious diseases. They can become stunted in their development or seriously disabled, unable to summon up or exercise the powers that they need if they are to survive, let alone flourish. Often human beings don't function well because they haven't yet learned what they need to learn if they're to flourish. They can be deprived of the opportunity to learn, or they can fail to make adequate use of the opportunities they have. And often human beings don't function well because of undisciplined desires that motivate them to act in ways that are bad for them or for others or for both. What matters is the part that each of these plays in the setting of each particular life as individuals pursue their individual and their common goods. What matters is how far and in what ways any of these is either an obstacle to or a distraction from the achievement by each particular individual of his final good, his ultimate end. Turn from good and bad to better and worse. If we're to characterize and compare particular goods and particular bads, it must always be with reference to the parts that they play in particular lives. But how are we to do this? Some answers to this question have suggested that we need to think not only in terms of good and bad, but in terms of good and evil. The word evil comes to us from Old English and Middle English, where it could be used interchangeably with bad, as could some other words. In 16th and 17th century English, as a result, there were several words for bad. This made 16th and 17th century English quite unlike Biblical Hebrew, or classical and biblical Greek, or classical and medieval Latin, all of which have just the single linguistic antithesis between good and bad, the antithesis that I've sketched in this paper so far. Tov and Ra in Hebrew, agathos and kakos in Greek, bonus and malus in Latin. Translation between those languages preserves this single antithesis. So Jerome in the Vulgate translates the Greek of Matthew's Gospel 21:41. I know that almost everybody here will immediately say, oh yes, Matthew 21:41. It is in fact, it was in the Gospel for Sunday Mass a few weeks ago. It's in the story of the tenants of the vineyard who, when the time comes for them to pay what is due to the Lord of the vineyard, beat his servants and finally kill his son. And then retribution is predicted. So Jerome in the Vulgate translated the Greek of Matthew's Gospel, which is kakous kakos apolisai, word for word, by malos male perdent. In English, if we put it into word for word, he will destroy the bad badly. But consider what 16th and 17th century English translators in fact made of it. In Tyndale's version it became, he will cruelly destroy those evil persons. The Douai version runs, he will bring those evil men to an evil end. The authorized version has it that he will miserably destroy those wicked men. Good is contrasted with evil or wicked or miserable, not just with bad. So how should we speak now? Should our speech follow the precedents of Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, or those of 16th and 17th century English? One influential answer, characteristically taken for granted rather than argued for, is that we should continue to use bad in a wide range of cases, but should reserve evil for what we take to be cases of extreme human wickedness. So we will not speak of evil jam or evil weather, nor will we speak of the lazy or the indiscreet as evil, reserving that term for badness so extreme that the word bad seems to us inadequate, perhaps for such paradigm cases of wickedness as that of those who torture children or engage in mass killing. What this mode of speech presupposes is that we can rank order the different ways and degrees in which human agents can be bad on a single scale, distinguishing the mildly wicked, the moderately wicked, the very wicked, and those at the extremes of wickedness for whom we will reserve the appellation evil. But can we in fact so distinguish? It has seemed obvious to many that we both can and must, the most eminent of whom is Dante. It is in Canto 11 of the Inferno that Virgil explains to Dante the downward ordering of hell. In limbo are good but unbaptized pagans. Below them are the incontinent and the heretics. Next are the malicious, first of all those guilty of having achieved their ends by violence, assassins, thieves, and tyrants, suicides, blasphemers, sodomites, and usurers. Then come those whose malice was served not by violence but by craft, when the use of that craft was to deceive those with no special reason to trust them. And lower still come those who in deceiving others violated bonds of kinship or due loyalty or hospitality or gratitude. Finally, in the mouths of Satan, we find Judas Iscariot, and with him Brutus and Cassius, betrayers and slayers of Julius Caesar. I have, of course, grossly abbreviated and simplified Dante's account, ignoring, for example, his use of distinctions borrowed from Cicero and Aristotle, though I should note how surprised Cicero and Aristotle would be if they were to discover the use to which Dante had put their distinctions. But it's not only Cicero and Aristotle who should find Dante's hierarchy surprising and odd, so should we. And we can't but be prompted to ask not just what may be mistaken in the particularities of Dante's account, but whether there may not be something misguided, even if brilliantly and imaginatively misguided, in the project of constructing such an account. Let us first remind ourselves that everything bad is, or involves, some absence of, some deprivation of, some failure in respect of, some good. And then ask whether there could be a single, even if complex, hierarchy of goods. The answer is that what makes any particular good important to achieve is no more and no less than the place that its achievement will have if it is an individual good in some particular life, and if it is a common good in some particular set of lives. So that even though there is a supreme good, there is no single hierarchy of goods, and correspondingly no single hierarchy of bads, such as that imagined by Dante, since bads are important only insofar as the goods of which they are deprivations are important. Moreover, if there were such a hierarchy, there could be a highest bad. But as Aquinas argues, there can be no highest bad. As English translators, by the way, say, no highest evil, since there is no essence of badness, all badness being defect or absence, badness itself being definable only in terms of what it's not. If Aquinas is right about this, as I take him to be, then the project of finding a use for evil by reserving it for those of the wicked whose dispositions and deeds distinguish them from the mildly and the moderately wicked on some scale of badness, some single scale, fails. It may seem at this point that we should speak only of good and bad and not of good and evil. Or if this is too difficult for English speakers, at least to think only of good and bad. Speak in English if you must, we might say, but think in Hebrew, Latin, or Greek. In fact, in the earlier parts of this paper, I was essentially thinking and even speaking in really terms of Latin or Greek or Hebrew rather than English. I've now arrived at two provisional sets of conclusions. The first concern what it is to be a good or a bad human being, and here my conclusions are provisional because they involve both philosophical and moral contentions that are widely disputed. I can invite your assent only if I can supply adequate answers to the numerous objections that might be advanced against them. And this I can't do here. The second set concerned whether there is point and purpose in supplementing the contrast between good and bad with a contrast between good and evil. Here again, my conclusions can only be provisional, for to those conclusions there can be two replies. One is delivered in the voice of English-speaking common sense. It suggests that we need to look more widely at the uses of not only bad and evil and wicked, but of the whole range of negative evaluative expressions in English before we can arrive at any worthwhile conclusion. A second reply is that the contrast between good and evil, rather than good and bad, can only be understood in theological terms. And before we arrive at any conclusion, we need to ask, as we haven't done so far, what theology might have to say. Let's consider these two replies in turn. So far as the use of relevant evaluative expressions in English is concerned, an obvious starting point is with Shakespeare's plays. In part because Shakespeare wrote in just that period in which the canons of educated English speech were still being established, and in part because of his unique contribution to establishing those canons. It was, after all, Shakespeare who taught first the English and later on the rest of us to speak English as a language worth speaking, and this notably where issues of goodness or badness are concerned. In reading him, or better still hearing and seeing him performed, we need to attend to some key features of his moral discourse. The first is the extent of Shakespeare's moral vocabulary, one that varies between plays and within plays between characters. The second is a sense of moral complexity that Shakespeare uses that vocabulary to communicate. Alfred Harbage, in his excellent book, As They Liked It, subtitled A Study of Shakespeare's Moral Artistry, noted both that, and I quote, "The moral sentences most frequently quoted from the plays prove quite often to have emanated from a villain or a fool, and that Shakespeare presupposes an audience aware of this irony, an audience that already have in mind I quote again, a pre-existing distinction between good and evil. What distinction is this? It is one that allows for a recognition that almost every major character is presented as having something of both. Harbidge quotes Henry V. There is some soul of goodness in things evil, would men observingly distill it out. And Friar Lawrence, virtue itself turns vice, being misapplied, and vice sometimes by action dignified. And Harbidge could have multiplied such examples. None of this, of course, would have the importance that it does were these insights not expressed through particular characters and particular plots. My argument that there is not a single hierarchy of badness had as one of its premises that the relationships of goodness to badness are always in particular lives, and it's the particularities of these relationships in particular lives that provide Shakespeare with his subject matter. So there is in Shakespeare no notion of a single scale of goodness and badness. What there is a notable clarity as to the kinds and modes of goodness and badness within the framework of each particular plot, one that couldn't be achieved without Shakespeare's wide-ranging vocabulary. And it's in characterizing some of those kinds and modes that we begin to find it difficult to refrain from speaking not just of the bad, but also of the evil. Shakespeare himself is sparing in his use of the word evil. When he does use it, it is to refer to a variety of misfortunes and afflictions. But he leaves us in no doubt as to how we, his audience, are to pass judgment on his characters. Harbidge estimated that of the 775 characters in Shakespeare's 38 plays, 49% are presented as indubitably good even with flaws, 20% as good in the main, 14% as bad in the main, and 17% as indubitably bad, even if with occasional lapses into goodness. But the question for us is to how to characterize some of those outstandingly bad characters. I have in mind such characters as Iago in Othello and Edmund in King Lear. What they have in common is not just that they are bad, but they pursue their goals by exploiting the tendencies towards badness in others. And they do this with intelligence, with insight, with constancy of purpose, and with well-calculated risk-taking. To be bad as Iago is bad, or as Edmund is bad, requires notable qualities of character. The intelligence that they need is the quality of cleverness that Aristotle called denotes, not phronesis, the ability to identify the means needed to achieve one's ends, whether good or bad. Their insight is into the weaknesses and moral vulnerabilities of others. They are experts on badness. They pursue their goals persistently over time, and they confront opposition with daring. They can only act as they do and achieve the success that they achieve because they are not stupid, not imperceptive, not lazy or easily distracted, and not cowardly. To realize this is to understand that the reason why there are so few Iagos and so few Edmunds is perhaps not because the rest of us are so virtuous, but because we are so often stupid or imperceptive or lazy or cowardly. So Iago and Edmund are bad themselves, corrupt others, and exploit their badness, and do so by putting to work qualities of character that we expect to find in the virtuous. What name, then, are we to give to this kind of personality? They are not just bad, failures in this or that respect at being what they could be and ought to be. They are in love with their own badness and are pleased with the badness of others. The range of failures to be good on the part of others provides them with a means to further their own bad ends. In these ways, they go beyond the common or garden badness, the mediocre badness that is all that most of us are capable of. We're bad at even being bad. They are very, very good at being bad. We therefore need some word to distinguish them from others, and the word that has been conscripted for this purpose is evil. So when the philosopher Stuart Hampshire interrogated a number of Nazi leaders, most notably Ernst Kaltenbrunner, in preparation for the Nuremberg trials, he identified in their murderous perversity of will, reason, and desire a distinctive quality for which he could find no name but evil. The quality of Shakespeare's fictions become human fact. If this is what evil is, how are we to think about it? What part does evil, so understood, play within our scheme of the virtues and vices? It should, I suggest, be given some importance in our thinking about the theological vices. When I speak of the theological vices, I'm not referring to the vices of theologians, but to those vices that are the counterparts of the theological virtues of faith, of hope, and of charity. Here I'll be concerned with what it is to lack charity. Because charity is an infused virtue, we can't discipline and educate ourselves into charity. What we can become and be is more or less open to charity. And we can fail in openness to charity in at least three ways. The first is by giving to loves other than the love of God and the love of our neighbour too great and engrossing a place in our lives. If we care too much, or in the wrong ways, about achieving success or making money or celebrity or pleasure or power, then our loves and with them our lives become disordered. We become the victims of our own desires, distracted from the good that's our final end. And insofar as we don't care about that good, we're not open to charity. So certain kinds of failure in the moral virtues are also failures in openness to the requirements of charity. This truth is exemplified by those who fail in openness to charity in a second way. We can fail to be open to charity not by caring for the wrong things, but by not caring for anything at all. Aquinas names among the vices opposed to charity Acadia, and his Dominican translators in 1911 translated Acadia by sloth. My guess is that to most English speakers today, sloth is as unfamiliar a word as Acadia, and so I shall speak of Acadia. Aquinas draws his account of Acadia from John Damascene, who described it as an oppressive sorrow, one which so weighs upon the mind of a human being that they want to do nothing. And so they don't care enough about what they need to care about if they're to be just or courageous, let alone open to the requirements of charity. This same relationship between failure in the theological virtues and failure in the moral virtues is evident in those who sin against charity most strikingly, those whose vice is hatred of God. It may perhaps seem, as Aquinas at once allows, that it's impossible to hate God. For if one conceives of God as he is, then one couldn't hate him. Yet if one doesn't conceive of God as he is, then whatever it is that one's hating, it's not God. But so to argue and so to conclude would be a mistake. For we may hate something or someone that is God without recognizing that that someone or something is God. In the natural order of things, what we grasp is that we have goods, and a good towards which and in terms of which those goods are ordered. And because that good is in fact God, whether we know this or not, if we hate that good, we hate God. What then is it to hate that good? It's to desire that, when good and bad are in conflict, good should be defeated. Whenever its pursuit and achievement are obstacles to my goals, goals that I care about, not because they are good, but just because they are mine. It is to be Iago or Edmund or Kaltenbrunner. We might decide then to reserve the word evil for those who exhibit this particular theological vice, something that Aquinas as a Latin speaker couldn't have done. In doing so, we supplement Aquinas with Shakespeare in an important way. For in all our moral thinking and judgment, we understand the concepts and rules that we employ only through the language needed to spell out the examples in which they find application. The language and the examples are indispensable to our understanding of the concepts and rules, something that those of us who trade in abstractions don't always remember. So Shakespeare and Dante and Sophocles and Jane Austen and Tolstoy are as indispensable to our thinking about good and bad and evil as are Aristotle and Aquinas and Geach. In moral matters, the mind is mindless without the imagination.
Yes, my name is Peter Wicks, formerly of this parish, but now at the Elm Institute in New Haven. Thank you very much. I have a question which I hope relies on an accurate understanding of the view that's been presented. It seemed to me that enlisting, I think as you put it, the term evil to describe those who are unusually good at being bad, as opposed to most of us who sort of lack the effectiveness to do it properly, very much puts the agent at the center. But when you referred earlier to the reason we might reach for the language of evil from a sense of the inadequacy of the term bad, one might have imagined doing that more with a focus on the particular actions and to sort of try and capture the enormity of certain kinds of wrongdoing that go beyond the sort of ordinary wrongdoing of everyday life. Does your account leave room to make the use of the language evil do that role too? Or is the goal to focus on the judgment of moral agents?
Thank you very much. It's very important here that when one is told about something very bad, very, very bad that has happened, the immediate first question will be, were the actions that brought this about actions that were aiming at this kind of badness? Was the intention that informed those actions the intention to bring about this kind of badness? And this question is something that is asked recurrently in this country now, every time there is one of those terrible mass killings. We want to know whether, in fact, what the agent was doing was, in fact, an effect of some kind of extraordinary mental disturbance, some kind of insanity, or whether it was informed by an intention, and if so, what the intention was. And here, one can't separate. It's important to distinguish the agent and the action, but one can't separate the characterization of the act as an action from the characterization of the agent. If you perform with the intention that informs your action a particular kind of injustice to bring this about, you are an unjust person. So this is why you can't treat of actions and agents independently of each other. Is that clear?
Yes, thank you.
Nevin Kleiman-Higa, postdoc here at Notre Dame. So I also wanted to ask in particular about the argument that you gave against interpreting evil just as very bad. So as I understood the argument that you gave, it was that this interpretation presupposes that it's possible to rank, that there's some scale that we can measure goodness on and correspondingly then badness on. And my question is this, if you're right that it presupposes that and that there is no such scale, would that also imply that we can't make sense of just the concept of very bad? And isn't that a concept that Greek and Hebrew and Latin speakers could employ, even if they didn't have a word for evil?
It's very important that we distinguish kinds and modes of badness. And my argument that we can characterize evil in a way that we approach through Shakespeare was intended to enable us to identify certain kinds and modes as having the peculiarity that justified us in speaking of evil. Within these particular kinds and modes, there can, of course, be different degrees of badness. But it's very important that simply characterizing what happened independently of the intention informing the action won't give us, it will tell us how bad what was suffered was, but it won't tell us how bad the action was, let alone whether in fact the intention informing the action was such that we could speak of evil. Do you want me to press further than that?
Well, that sounds plausible to me. It sounds different from the argument.
Oh no, that's the argument in the paper. The argument in the paper is that I cannot simply pick out a list of things which could be done, which could happen with human beings bringing them about, so that in the end there's a single scale from the less bad to the very baddest of all.
Okay, Jim?
Jim Sturba at Notre Dame. Those who are very good at being bad, they could also be happy and flourish and successful in doing that. And in some sense, it looks like we might say they're flourishing at being bad. But you don't want to say that.
They're not flourishing qua human beings, qua rational agents. They're flourishing in quite another mode. I'm perfectly happy to say that. But this is why it's so important to speak of human beings flourishing qua human beings.
Yeah, but when we look around, those who are flourishing in this sense may look better than those who are flourishing in the other sense. The people flourishing in the more, what I would call moral sense, maybe not. They sometimes could be unhappy and unsuccessful, and that they'll be flourishing as human beings. But the people who are flourishing in this other sense, they will be successful and happy and get their ends.
But if you see, let me put it like this, and if you were to take it that flourishing in this mode, that is flourishing not through having become disposed to act as the virtues dictate, but because one is cheerfully successful in aggrandizing one's so on and so forth. If one were to think of that as genuinely flourishing, that would tell you something about oneself.
I agree.
Anybody who's tempted to think that this is genuinely flourishing shows that they haven't grasped what flourishing qua a human being is, that they are as bad as the people they approve of.
Yeah, I agree with that. It just the flourishing has this sense of kind of looking good, and it may not look good at all.
But, I mean, the notion of looking good, I mean, yes, of course, lots of people are very good at looking good. Universities are full of them. But, you know, it's precisely in not being taken in by them that is one of the marks of the virtues.
And we have a cue here, so we'll go here, here, and here.
I'm Elizabeth Russell. I'm a recent graduate from Northeast Catholic College. My senior year was actually largely influenced by your book After Virtue. We spent about half the year on that. Thank you very much for your talk. I very much enjoyed it. I'm currently a writing teacher, and when I teach my students how to write, I tell them that they're not allowed to use banned words. So good and bad are part of that. It's because in English we have a lot of synonyms that you don't think of when you're in middle school. But we were talking about when we made up a list of synonyms to good and bad had a much longer list. And you mentioned that. And I guess I'm just wondering, why is there, if bad was good enough for the ancient languages, why do we have this, this long list now? Are we in English, are we over consumed with thinking about just how miserable we are? Why don't we have an equally proportionate list of good words as well? So I just wanted your thoughts on that.
You raised an extremely interesting question that needs a very long answer. English today is not a good language. I mean, it's not by and large. And it's not a good language because it has allowed for elaboration in different directions by different groups who very often pick up each other's mode of speaking. Consider the uses in contemporary America of such words as neat and awesome. I mean, one could go on multiplying the way in which vocabulary is multiplied as people try to adopt distinctive modes of speech. And the result is they oscillate between sets of colloquialisms that are not really part of the common language. On the other hand, then they fall back on extremely crude and simple-minded ways of speaking. And if I were to illustrate these, it would take far too long. English used not to be like this. And one additional reason to those in the paper for talking about Shakespeare is that I really do think Shakespeare made English a language worth speaking. I think that those of us who are compelled by force to give up our native languages and to speak English would have a great deal to complain about if it weren't for Shakespeare. And that I would, as it were, think that in educating people these days, making them take part in Shakespeare plays and to learn to speak as Shakespeare spoke is very, very important. Now, not only Shakespeare, of course, there are plenty of other great speakers, but Shakespeare is definitive here in providing a canon. And languages without such a canon often create great problems about shared moral discourse. Because the crucial thing about moral discourse is we need a genuinely common language, a language in which we can hear clearly what other people are really saying, and they can hear clearly what we are saying. And in English today, it is very difficult to achieve this, and one can see this at work in all sorts of contexts in different English-speaking countries.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go here. Maybe our last question. Yes. I think I'm Father Bob Gall from Santa Croce in Rome. And I fear that I missed something regarding your critique of the existing of a scale of goods and a scale of bads. And I did understand, I think, that following Aquinas, you asserted that there is a highest good. And I would think that there may be other ways of understanding a hierarchy of other goods that lead towards the highest good according to either that which is most specific to human flourishing or according to something like that which is more formal or final in the order of virtuous perfection. And I would think that, therefore, one could speak of the parallel lacks or defects with respect to those as also constituting some kind of scale or hierarchy of bads. Did I misunderstand something?
Well, I'd have to do two things if I was to reply to. First of all, we'd have to go back to what Aquinas says in the Summa Contra Gentiles, which I was relying on, where although, of course, he allows there's a highest good, but he doesn't think that, I believe, there's any single scale here. And at this point, I think I'm simply expounding what Aquinas says. Now, as to whether Aquinas is right about this, here I would simply have to spell out further the arguments in the paper. And I would have to go and look at the very, very different kinds of badness that there are, and how it's not just a matter of scale or a matter of the kind of reaction, but also a matter of how longer run intentions become embodied in actions. At this point, one of the things that I would like to do would be to look at the case histories of, for example, the Nazi leaders. Let me just give one example because it may help to make the point clear. Hermann Goering was not an anti-Semite. He had friends who were Jews, and there were Jews who had in his earlier life done him good turn, and he took considerable trouble to protect them under the Nazi regime, so that they did not, in fact, suffer persecution or execution. Nonetheless, he went along with the Holocaust, with the mass killing of the Jews. It isn't something he'd have set on foot himself. It wasn't anything he participated in at all. But if a man wants to build up a first-class art collection by looting, there are things you just have to put up with. Now, I think in many ways this is more evil than participating in the Holocaust. You might think, just sitting on one side and saying, well, I'll let those others do it because I can do rather well out of this on the side in quite other matters. That's a kind of evil. Well, the moment you look for a scale here, things start breaking apart. What matters is these are very different kinds of evil. And I think once one has started looking at particular cases, the notion of a single scale becomes implausible. I don't, by the way, think that we need to mean that we need to think that Dante took his scale all that seriously either. There is something comic at certain points in the way Dante uses the notion of hell, and if you look at the particular people that get consigned in particular levels, sometimes it's clear that Dante is making a joke of a certain sort.
Thank you very much.
We'll take the final two questions here.
Hi, my name's Kelly. I'm a graduate student at Baylor. Thank you very much for your talk. You've said today, as well as before, that we only deliberate well in the company of others. But I've often wondered if there's a counterexample to defeat that universal.
Sorry, I can't hear.
Oh, okay. Let me repeat myself. You've said today, as well as before, that we only deliberate well in the company of others.
Yes, right.
Okay. But I've often wondered if there's a counterexample to defeat that universal. What if the people with whom which we are able to deliberate are a community of Iagos? What if it's a community whose narrative and imagination is good at being bad? Something like Athens, maybe before Socrates showed up, or something like that. Would you be better off to deliberate alone and then go out in the community, like Socrates might have, or something like that? Or am I missing a crucial point?
Notice that I say that it is important to deliberate in the company of others where our relationships with those others are informed by truthfulness and by justice in general. We need others who are extremely honest in their relationships with us and vice versa, who are prepared to say the truth about, or occasion to tell the truth about us, even when that truth is extremely unwelcome. So we learn to deliberate well about what we shall do, because whenever so often we say, now I think I'm going to do so-and-so, somebody has to say to you, you're out of your mind. You're not capable of doing that. You're completely exaggerating what you're capable of, and so on, right? And I mean, one of the things about the institution of marriage is that it provides for this kind of deliberation.
That's true.
My name is Morgan Brownfield, and I'm a senior politics major at Hillsdale College. During your talk, you distinguish between two sorts of evil, that kind of evil as something that is evil in itself, and then the kind of evil that is just evil in its effect. Later on in your talk, you then noted that the definition of evil was a deprivation of good. Does that definition of evil that you posited apply to both sorts of evils, that is, evil in effect and evil in itself?
No, I made two distinctions. The first was about badness. Evil doesn't come into it. Almost all badness is badness because it is malfunctioning. It is an absence of something, a failure in something, a deprivation. But the badness of pain is not just that. If you suffer bad toothache, or various other kinds of bad pain, these may not be all that disabling. You're still able to go on doing things. It's very bad. And if you inflict pain on others, you make things bad for them. So that's what I meant when I talked about bad in itself. That's very different from the distinction that I was drawing later between bad and evil. And here it matters that what makes an Iago or an Edmund or a Kaltenbrunner evil is never a single action, no matter how awful. It is being in love with badness and working hard, because one loves badness, at bringing badness about. So that this is different from just being bad. And here there's no question, one doesn't have to bring in this in itself or otherwise. That distinction doesn't apply there.